Chapter 19, Safe Democracy, United States in World War I, 1916 to 1920. Now, no, the war did not last to 1920, but the chapter covers through 1920. And we didn't call it World War I back then because we didn't know we were going to have a second one. They called it the war to end all wars because it was a world war. Or, as the men who were in it like to call it, the Great One. Now, the Spanish-American War had made the U.S. an international empire. But compared to Europe's colonial empires, our overseas possessions were very small. And our empire was not territorial so much as it was economic and cultural. At the start of the 20th century, the world's economy was already very highly globalized, and although Britain still dominated world finance and its currency dominated world trade, the United States had become the leading industrial power. By 1914, the year the World War began in Europe, the United States was making more than 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods. And its steel, its oil, its agricultural equipment, and consumer goods were just inundating the European markets. And along with American goods moving into Europe, a lot of Americans, especially those from national and ethnic groups who were interested in their lands of their origins, such as the Irish Americans supporting independence from England, the American Jews opposed to religious persecution in Russia, and the Black Americans wanting to uplift Africa. Unfortunately, because of our increasing economic and cultural connections with the world, it led to, shall we say, an elevated military presence and political involvement. Between 1900 and 1920, the principles that are going to guide our American foreign policy for the rest of the 20th century are formed. For instance, the open door policy that American trade, investment, and information and culture should flow freely to the other nations. And of course, we discussed their foreign policy, or our foreign policy, in terms of freedom. Well, we seem to believe that to promote the universal ideas of liberty and democracy, we had to spread our economic and political influence. The progressive era presidents that we had, who expanded government power at home, did so abroad as well. And initially, their interventions occurred primarily in the Western Hemisphere, which we had made our sphere and as overseers of the Monroe Doctrine. Between 1901 and 1920, the United States Marines landed in the Caribbean countries more than 20 times, usually to secure a better economic environment for American companies, especially those that wanted free access to raw materials, or the bankers who wanted to be assured that their loans were going to be repaid. It's just a map showing you that North, Central, and South America are our domain, basically. But look how Africa is chopped up by all the different countries. And even India and China and the Philippine Islands, they're all owned by different people. Excuse me. They're spheres of influences. Now, not FDR, but Teddy Roosevelt had divided the world into what he called civilized and uncivilized nations. And he believed that the civilized nations were obligated to establish order in a very chaotic world. He was far more engaged in international policy than any of his predecessors, and while he disclaimed any American interest in acquiring overseas territory, he did order multiple interventions in Central America. His first action, or major action, was actually engineering the separation of Panama from Colombia. Don't you love that phraseology? Engineering the separation. He did this in order to build a canal linking the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. That just shows you the location. Those Caribbean islands are just really awful tempting out there, like fruit hanging from a tree. In 1903, Colombia refused to cede the land for the canal. So Roosevelt helped to launch an uprising in Panama, and then he deployed American gunboats to prevent the Colombian army from suppressing it. So having secured Panamanian independence and a treaty giving the U.S. the right to construct and operate a canal and have sovereignty over the canal zone, Roosevelt launched one of the greatest construction and engineering projects in history. I took the canal zone, he later explained. The project finished in 1914, and it did facilitate American and world trade by drastically cutting shipping time. Because now you don't have to go all around South America. You can just come across from the Caribbean Sea all the way across to the Gulf of Panama. It saves a lot of time and effort and money and gas and coal and everything. But Roosevelt's interventionist policy came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And this policy expressed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power in the Western Hemisphere, allowing us not just to prevent European intervention in the Americas, as the Monroe Doctrine had specified, but forcefully to intervene whenever we deemed it necessary. Roosevelt feared that a financial instability in the Americas simply invited European powers to intervene whenever they felt their investments were threatened. So in 1904, Roosevelt invaded the Dominican Republic to ensure that its custom houses repaid debts to Europe and American investors. In 1906, he sent troops to Cuba to ensure stability after a disputed election, and they stayed through 1909. Now, President Taft sent Marines to Nicaragua to protect a government friendly to us and our economic interests, but he emphasized economic investment and loans from banks rather than direct military intervention as the best means to spread American influence. Now, this policy came to be known as dollar diplomacy, and it took shape in Taft's efforts to shape the economies of Honduras, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic, and even Liberia. Now, the very highly moralistic Woodrow Wilson brought what we call a missionary zeal and a sense of his own and America's righteousness to foreign policy. They call it missionary diplomacy, as a matter of fact. And he's been known to begin the day at the White House with a prayer and a Bible reading and singing a song. He made William Jennings Bryan, a very devout anti-imperialist, his Secretary of State. Then he repudiated the dollar diplomacy of Taft, and he promised to respect Latin America's independence and free it from economic domination from anyone else but us. But Wilson believed the United States had a duty to instruct other nations in democracy. I'm going to repeat that because I screwed it up. President Wilson believed that the U.S. had a duty to instruct, don't you love that word, instruct other nations in democracy, and that our exports and investments spread American political ideas. Well, for Wilson, our economic influence served a higher purpose than just profit, and his moral imperialism made for military interventions more than any other president before or since. He sent Marines to Haiti in 1915 and the Dominican Republic in 1916, all to protect American financial interests, and they stayed in the latter country until 1924, and the former 1934. Wilson was most involved in Mexico, where a 1911 revolution led by Franco Madero overthrew the Diaz long-standing dictatorship. In 1913, without Wilson's knowledge, but with the support of the U.S. ambassador and American companies, which controlled Mexico's oil and mines, and the military commander Victorio Huerta, Hueta, assassinated Madero and seized power. Wilson was outraged, would not extend recognition, and vowed to teach those Latin Americans to elect good men. When civil war erupted, Wilson sent troops to Veracruz to prevent arms shipments, and they were met as invaders and attacked by Mexican troops. Yeah, I think so. In 1916, after Mexican troops led by Pancho Villa killed Americans in a New Mexico town close to the border, Wilson ordered 10,000 American troops to invade northern Mexico to apprehend him. And they didn't get it done. So World War I, what started it? And when it started, why in the world did an incident in a very small country halfway around the world escalate into a full-scale world war? And why did it last so long? 14 million dead, 7 million disabled. It was the cause of the beginnings of communism. It destroyed farmlands. It killed entire generations of French young men. And it destroyed empires. It added insult to injury, because after the war, more than 40 million men, women, and children died of the flu. This is a brief little video. I think it'll give you something to think about.
Possibly the single most pondered question in history. What caused the unbound, senseless slaughter that was the First World War? It wasn't, like in World War II, a case of a single belligerent pushing others to take a military stand. It didn't have the moral vindication of resisting a tyrant. Rather, a delicate but toxic balance of structural forces created a dry tinder that was lit by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That event precipitated the July Crisis, which saw the major European powers hurtle toward open conflict. The MAIN acronym is often used to analyze the war. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. It's simplistic, but provides a useful framework. The late 19th century was an era of military competition, particularly between the major European powers. The policy of building a stronger military was judged relative to neighbours, creating a culture of paranoia that heightened the search for alliances. It was fed by the cultural belief that war is good for nations. Germany in particular looked to expand its navy. However, the naval race was never a real contest. The British always maintained naval superiority. But the British obsession with naval dominance was strong. Government rhetoric exaggerated military expansionism. A simple naivety in the potential scale and bloodshed of a European war prevented several governments from checking their aggression. A web of alliances developed in Europe between 1870 and 1914, effectively creating two camps bound by commitments to maintain sovereignty or intervene militarily. The Triple Alliance of 1882 linked Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The Triple Entente of 1907 linked France, Britain and Russia. A historic point of conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia was over their incompatible Balkan interests, and France had a deep suspicion of Germany, rooted in their defeat in the 1870 war. The alliance system primarily came about because after 1870, Germany, under Bismarck, set a precedent by playing its neighbours' imperial endeavours off one another in order to maintain a balance of power within Europe. Imperial competition also pushed the countries towards adopting alliances. Colonies were units of exchange that could be bargained without significantly affecting the metropole. They also brought nations who would otherwise not interact into conflict and agreement. For example, the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, over aspirations in China, helped bring the Triple Entente into being. It has been suggested that Germany was motivated by imperial ambitions to invade Belgium and France. Certainly the expansion of the British and French empires, fired by the rise of industrialism and the pursuit of new markets, caused some resentment in Germany, and the pursuit of a short, aborted imperial policy in the late 19th century. However, the suggestion that Germany wanted to create a European empire in 1914 is not supported by the pre-war rhetoric and strategy. Nationalism was also a new and powerful source of tension in Europe. It was tied to militarism and clashed with the interests of the imperial powers in Europe. Nationalism created new areas of interest over which nations could compete. For example, the Habsburg Empire was a tottering agglomeration of 11 different nationalities, with large Slavic populations in Galicia and the Balkans, whose nationalist aspirations ran counter to imperial cohesion. Nationalism in the Balkans also piqued Russia's historic interest in the region. Indeed, Serbian nationalism created the trigger cause of the conflict, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ferdinand and his wife were murdered in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Bosnian Serbian nationalist terrorist organization, the Black Hand Gang. Ferdinand's death, which was interpreted as a product of official Serbian policy, created the July Crisis, a month of diplomatic and governmental miscalculations that saw a domino effect of war declarations initiated. The historical dialogue on this issue is vast and distorted by substantial biases. Vague and undefined schemes of reckless expansion were imputed to the German leadership in the immediate aftermath of the war, with the war guilt clause. The notion that Germany was bursting with newfound strength, proud of her abilities and eager to showcase them, was overplayed. The almost laughable rationalization of British imperial power as necessary or civilizing didn't translate to German imperialism, which was aggressive and expansionist. There is an ongoing historical discussion on who, if anyone, was most culpable. Blame has been directed at every single combatant at one point or another, and some have said that all the major governments considered it a golden opportunity for increasing popularity at home. The Schlieffen Plan could be blamed for bringing Britain into the war. The scale of the war could be blamed on Russia as the first big country to mobilize. Inherent rivalries between imperialism and capitalism could be blamed for polarizing the combatants. Every point has some merit, but in the end, what proved most devastating was the combination of an alliance network with the widespread, misguided belief that war is good for nations, and that the best way to fight a modern war was to attack. That the war was inevitable is questionable, but certainly the notion of glorious war, of war as good for nation building, was strong pre-1914. By the end of the war, it was dead.
Remember, MAIN, militarism, alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. So if I were to ask you what was the cause of the war, it would be these four things. Excuse me, I'm trying to come down with a cold. If I ask you what started the war, it would be the assassination of the Archduke. So there's a difference between cause and start. On June the 14th, 1914, we had this explosion when the Archduke was killed that started us on a downhill slide into hell. Now, some of this information is in your text, but not a lot of it. So I'm going to briefly summarize, because unless you've had Western Civ lately, or you know anything about history, you like the Filipino War you'd never heard of, you know very little about the World War I. Of course, it wasn't called that at the time. But to give you a little background as to why it happened and why we got involved, you need to have a little bit of European history. So this is just background information. In Europe, it was always considered important to have a balance of power. Anytime one nation got stronger than the other, there was a problem. So you had to maintain this balance. Wars have been fought for centuries over the balances of power. Now, the major powers in Europe are France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and England. Italy is on the stage right now. She's just recently become unified, and she wants to be a player, but she's not a player yet. So we're going to start with France. At one time, France had been the leading power in Europe. She had the largest army, and this is where it was at. Paris was the place. But over the years, we're starting to lag behind in population. We've got problems in the military. The military is weak. They have fallen way behind not only Germany and England, but the U.S. in industrialization. They'd had revolutions inside. We kept changing one government for the other. But they were extremely nationalistic. Austria-Hungary. It's not one country. It consists of a bunch of countries. Hungary, of course, being the main one. And you got Bohemia. You got Czechoslovakia. You got Romania. And it's an absolute monarchy ruled by a group called the Habsburgs, which is an aging Catholic dynasty. And if you'll notice that most of those countries are not Catholic. They had a very oppressed peasantry, and they themselves, the Austro-Hungarians, are very nationalistic. Unfortunately, so are the countries that they control. And you've got Russia. Now, Russia's always been like the country cousin. They've got a lot of amount of land. They have beautiful resources, but they're just a little bit behind times. They can't seem to get it together, if you would. They want so bad to be on the world stage, and they keep marrying the children of the European nobility, trying to find a place at the table, so to speak, and it just doesn't quite work that way. As a matter of fact, the current Tsarina of Russia during the war is the daughter of Queen Victoria of England. But Russia has no middle class. It's an absolute monarchy, and their nobility is not loyal to the Tsar at all. It had a revolution in 1905 and freed a lot of the peasants. And they got into a war with that little bitty island country called Japan, and they lost. They lacked power, they lacked prestige in Europe, and oh, they really wanted to be on the world stage. Great Britain. Now, Great Britain is a major sea power, has been for a couple of centuries, and is going to continue to be so. But she has a very small army. She's always dependent on her navy. She also is the leading master of imperialism, and the expression "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was quite true. There was always some area of the world she controlled that the sun was shining on. She's a major industrial power with only Germany being ahead of her, because you've got Germany, you've got England, Germany, and America. I'm sorry, the dog distracted me. She has also the benefit of having a very stable government. Italy, as I said, she's not a major power yet, but she's working on it. She's only recently been united. So she's divided politically, she's got social and economic problems, and she's justifying military expenditures way beyond her means, because she figures if she can become an imperialistic power, and she can be on the world stage, and so she goes to Africa and promptly goes to war with a small black country. Germany. Now, Germany is a major sea power also, but not quite as big as England. She has a monarchy. She's extremely militaristic. Leader in industrial revolution. She's one of the top industrial producers. And she's a country that is the most prepared for war. Her people are very obedient, and her military is top-notch. So you've got these alliances. You've got Great Britain and Russia and France are allied, as he told you in a little video. You got Germany and Austria-Hungary, and a little bit later it's going to be Italy. And they got the Balkans. One of the Balkans consists of Bulgaria and Albania, Greece, Bosnia, Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. As you can see right here, these are what we call the Balkans. I've always thought the Balkans should be up here in the Baltic Sea, because here you've got the Adriatic Sea, and here's the Balkans. To me, it doesn't make any sense, but that's what they do. So you've got Italy, which is not really united yet. Spain is a hotbed of intrigue, but she never really gets involved. She stays out of it. So you've got the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. Now these are going to be allies, more really for trade than for military backup. And you've got Germany, and you've got Austria-Hungary, and of course she controls all these characters through here. So if you look at it, Germany gets kind of paranoid. She's got people on the east and people on the west that are her enemies. So if something happens, she's got to keep Austria-Hungary happy and keep her strong, because otherwise she'd be all alone. So Germany begins this massive naval buildup at the end of the 19th century. And Russia is unhappy with the German Austria-Hungary allies, because Russia doesn't like Austria-Hungary, but she doesn't like the way Austria-Hungary is treating all those Serbians, because she's a friend of Serb and they're part of her ethnic background. Britain thought Germany was a sea threat, so she starts building up her navy. So Germany increases the size of her army, and France looks across the border that, oops, we better do it too, so she builds up her army. So as you can see, Europe's becoming a powder keg, just waiting for someone to strike a match. And everybody in Europe's very leery of what's going on in the Balkans, because those people, they're not Catholic. They resent the Austria-Hungary being power over them. They want free, and they're always causing problems. So France and Germany are traditional enemies. They've been to war several times over the last couple of centuries. One time Germany will win, one time France will leave. France needed allies, so she signed the agreement with England and Russia. And neither one of them really want to go to help the other one, because you've got Germany in between. Well, Germany did not like the agreement that they three had. And like I say, her only ally is the Austria-Hungary. And they reserved to keep her in power and keep her dignity up, because, like I say, if she falls, Germany's going to be all alone out there in Europe. And you're pointing out again, I don't know why they've got Spain in yellow, because she's not connected with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at all. So here you've got France, here you've got Russia, here you've got Germany. And if Austria-Hungary falls, look, she's got enemies on both sides. And that's the last thing she wants to do, is have to fight a war on both fronts. Now, this is background information. You don't need to take notes from it. Now, the Balkans are demanding independence, and they're pushing Europe closer to war. Austria, meanwhile, annexes Bosnia and Herzegovina and agrees to support Russia's move to open the Dardanelles so she can have a warm water port on the Black Sea. Well, Russia failed to do it. So Serbia threatens to invade Bosnia to liberate her. In 1912, Bosnia attacks the dying Ottoman Empire. Takes all of the empire's European territories except Constantinople. And she gained Albania. Well, Austria doesn't want Serbia to keep it, so she's forced to surrender, like I said, what is now known as Albania. Now, this is Ferdinand and his wife. They're kind of middle-aged here. This is Not right before they died. They were older when they died, but this is not a young picture of it. They were both very attractive people. So June the 14th, 1914, Sarajevo. Now, 2 attempts were made on the Archduke's life that day. He was in Bosnia inspecting the maneuvers of the Austrian Army Corps, which was stationed there, and he devoted a whole day to a processional through the capital. And during the morning, a bomb was thrown at the motorcade, and although it didn't harm anybody, it should have been a warning. In the afternoon, in another part of town, a Serb student fired a revolver at the car, killing both the Archduke and the Duchess. Now, some say it was the student who fired the shot. An alternate theory is that a Sarajevo attack was conducted by the Sarajevan Military Intelligence Operation, which was known as the Black Hand. And the Black Hand was a, kind of a shadowy organization. It had been formed as a counterweight to the Bulgaria-sponsored international organization. And of course, the Black Hand is the one most historians believe in. But now the stage is set. Kaiser Wilhelm responded to a note from Austria to eliminate the Balkans as a power factor. And when Germany assured them that they would give them any support they needed, in other words, they gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, it begins. So they send an ultimatum to Serbia. Well, Russia hears the ultimatum, and Tsar Nicholas is given the advice by his war minister to prepare for war. The worst advice a leader's ever gotten from anyone. See, Russia doesn't like the way that Austria-Hungary is treating the Serbs, and this is her excuse, she thinks. Now things are going to happen fast. Britain doesn't think Serbia is a very nice place. She's not Christian, she's not in the British Empire, so when she's contacted by Germany and Austria-Hungary to see what she would do if there was some problems, she said, I don't care, she's not in my empire, do whatever you want to do. That combined with what they call the Shetland Plan of Germany, which was to go through neutral Belgium, take out France. That way, all Germany has to worry about is Russia on the east. It's a good plan if you hit hard and run fast. Well, Germany hears Russia is arming, and she declares war on Russia. Now, Russia has not made any overt moves. Right now, Austria-Hungary have declared war on Serbia. Germany's declared war on Russia. The British don't want to get involved. They just say, hey, leave me out of this. On August the 3rd, Germany sends a note across to England demanding access to go through Belgium to get to France, which is a bad thing to do because England and France have a treaty, right? Well, of course, it was refused. After all, Belgium is a neutral country. So on August the 4th, Germany kind of thumbs her nose at everybody and crosses the border. As soon as she crosses the border and starts killing Belgians, Britain declares war on Germany. Now Europe is at war. Now, war should not have happened. When it did, it should have stayed local. So what the hell happened? June the 14th, the Archduke's assassinated. August the 12th, Germany crosses the Belgian border, and in less than 6 weeks, we're starting to have actual fighting. Now, for the first time, we've got airplanes and tanks and hand grenades and machine guns and gas. Yes, we're going to have chemical warfare. There's going to be actions in Syria and Palestine, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. And there's revolts in Ireland and a Russian Revolution. Whoa. So what caused it? The main reason, now I don't have them in the order he had them. I've got nationalism, imperialism, militarism, alliance system. And he suggested MAIN, militarism, alliance, imperialism, and nationalism. However you put them in there. Those are the 4 reasons for the war. And now the stage is set for America's entry into this slaughter. Now, Americans are kind of deeply divided over the war. Many Americans are siding with Britain and associating it with liberty and democracy, and Germany with repression and aristocratic government. Others, particularly German and Irish Americans, oppose supporting the British. Immigrants from Russia, especially the Jews, did not want America to support Russia and its Tsar, and a despotic Russian alliance with Britain and France. Well, it made it hard to believe that the war was a conflict between democracy and autocracy. Yeah, I can't even say that right. I'm sorry. Many feminists, pacifists, and social reformers believed peace was necessary for reform at home, and they opposed American involvement. Now, Wilson at first declares neutrality, but naval warfare kind of disrupted our commerce and threatened our neutral stance. In May of 1914, a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 passengers, including 124 Americans. Well, Wilson protested strongly, and Americans were outraged, giving support to those who urged America to prepare for war. Advocates for preparedness, including Theodore Roosevelt and businessmen with ties to Britain, who happened to be America's largest trading partner and recipient of more than $2 billion in wartime loans from U.S. banks. Wilson was strongly pro-British, and I've got the word Anglophile up there, that's what he means. And he called Germany a natural enemy of liberty. And by 1915, the end of the year, he had ordered preparedness to begin the war. That's, of course, not an actual picture of Lusitania, it's just a picture of a postcard of it. In May of 1916, Wilson's preparedness policy seems to have worked, as Germany suspended submarine warfare against non-combatants, which allowed Americans to trade and travel freely without requiring any military action. "He's kept us out of the war," became Wilson's campaign slogan in 1916. The Republican Party was reunited again, and his candidate Charles Evan Hughes lost to Wilson, but by only a very narrow margin. Wilson acted quickly on January the 22nd and called for a peace without victory, and expressed his vision of a world order, including freedom of the seas, restriction of armaments, and self-determination for all nations, large and small. They're like a pipe dream. Germany soon resumed its submarine warfare against ships sailing to or from Great Britain and sank several American merchant ships, gambling that it would starve Britain into submission before America intervened militarily. In March of 1917, British spies made public something called the Zimmerman Telegram. It was a message from Germany to Mexico asking it to declare war against the United States so it could regain its territory lost in the Mexican War. And a revolution in Russia deposed the Tsar and established what at that time was a constitutional republic. And it seemed plausible to believe the United States would be fighting for democracy. On April the 2nd, Wilson asked Congress to declare war against Germany, which it did with a very small minority of dissenters in order to make the world safe for democracy. Now, let's stop there and think just a minute. Militarism, imperialism, nationalism, the alliance system, these are things that's going to cause the war. In 1916, Wilson campaigned on peace and progressivism, trade on the U.S. mind, not to get involved in the war. If we were not at war, couldn't we trade with both sides? Well, makes sense. So the war broke out, and Britain blockades all German ports and limits goods the U.S. can sell to Germany. And it forbids all foodstuffs and most raw materials, and by the way, it considered cotton a raw material. We couldn't even do it ourselves, and it started censoring all incoming mail, even from us. It began to blacklist any American firms dealing with Germany, and it stopped all ships and confiscated cargoes. And here we get into a small, I think, cute little story. Of course, we complain considerably that you can't do this to us because they're, our ships, and so we make our money, and we're not at war. And England comes back with, cotton can be considered a war contraband because they take cotton to make uniforms. And we're just raising Cain, and so Britain says, I understand your position. You're costing your people money, but I'll tell you what, we'll just buy the cotton. So instead of selling it to Germany, we'll buy it. Well, this is fine with us. We don't care who buys it as long as somebody buys it. And then the Britons turns around and says, oh, by the way, old boy, could you float us a loan to buy it? So we loaned him the money to buy our cotton. Crazy. President Wilson had to protest, and Britain didn't want to really anger us. In reality, the only real deterrent we had were the U-boats. The U.S. trade is growing, and between loans and trade, we're getting closer and closer to the Allies. Now, I have it in red. You do need to know who the Allies were. Great Britain, France, and Russia were allies. We're not in it yet. The Central Powers are Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy's not in it yet. Now, undersea boot, which I love that word, it simply means undersea boat in German. The submarine, which we call a U-boat. Now, all this stuff is new, so there's no rules. I mean, how do you write a rule when you don't know what it's capable of? In March of 1915, Americans are killed. In August of 1915, the Lusitania and an Arabian ship were sunk. February 1916, Germany declares unrestricted warfare against all armed vessels. And Wilson protests and threatens to break off diplomatic relations. And the Kaiser backs down again. And it's called the Sussex Pledge. He said he would pledge not to intervene with non-combatant ships, and we, okay, fine. A very short period of peace, and this is when Wilson runs for re-election. Okay, this kind of brings us up to date. Here's a campaign truck with a new development. Political campaign is something fairly new to the 20th century. Wilson redoubles his efforts for peace. Wilson, December 1916, he sends a message to the combatants. He wants peace without a victory. What does that mean? Well, the Allies refuse. What are you talking about? You're just going to quit the war, just stop right where we were. We're not going to do anything. Well, this just doesn't make any sense. So they will think about it. The Central Powers are very invasive. They don't want to do more than this. They've got to have some consultations. They know that Russia's on the brink of revolution, and she's going to withdraw from the war. January the 31st, 1917, Germany announces all ships would be sunk on sight. Wilson breaks off relations as he threatened to do, but he's still hoping for peace. On February the 25th, that Zimmerman telegram was released. February the 26th, Wilson requests merchant ships allowed to be armed. And some senators say, no, I don't think so. Wilson just kind of quietly tells the merchant ships, go ahead and arm. On March 13th, the same year, Navy is instructed to fire on any submarines that they see. U-boats are sinking ships. They sank 5 American ships. Now you're sinking our ships and you're killing our people. 8:30 p.m. on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson calls a special session of Congress, and he requests a declaration of war. Now, pacifists continued to hold out for 4 days, but on August 6, 1917, it wouldn't hurt to know, the United States issued a declaration of war against Germany. 40 House members and 6 senators voted against it. But the war begins with a burst of patriotism in this country. And it wasn't very long. It was the worst month of the war for the Allies. More than 881,000 tons of Allied shipping was sunk. The French army, because they can't get any supplies, there's mutinies in the French army. They're deserting by the droves. The British drive in Flanders is stalled, and this is where we're starting to see this trench warfare. Russia has had a revolution, and she signs a separate peace with Germany. And Germany and Australia forces rout the Italian army. Oh, okay. Now, on the home front. The U.S. was not prepared for war. General Blackjack Pershing was made commander of something called the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. On April the 7th, 1917, we had 200,000 officers and men. That's total. Most of those men who had any experience was in the Buffalo units and stationed out west. We had 300,000 old rifles that had been used in the Civil War. We had 1,500 machine guns not in good shape. We had 55 outdated airplanes, of which about 12 were flyable. I think we had 2 shortwave radios. The most recent military experience our Army had was chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico, and they hadn't caught him. Excuse me. It's just a picture of them loading up in the trucks. This is the first time we're going to have trucks to actually move the military. They don't have to walk to where they're going. They can ride in trucks. Now, the Selective Service Act was initiated in May of 1917. It's a draft, plain, pure, and simple. And for the first time, black men were drafted. And 4 African-American regiments were sent overseas to France. And we don't have the time. I wished we did. The first American troops to land in France in war for World War I were a group of black troops from Spartanburg, South Carolina. They'd been forced out of town. Well, they had been forced out of town. The Greek people of Spartanburg were not too thrilled with these black troops having guns, training in their area, so they did everything they could to cause problems. And they did manhandle a certain member of the regimental band, and when he told his crewmates what had happened, they were going to go into town and raise some cane, destroy the town. There was enough of them to do it, but the powers that be heard about it, and they managed to stop them, so they had a choice. They could either do what Spartanburg wanted them to do, move the troops somewhere else. They could send them overseas with they hadn't completed their training, or they could leave them there and cause problems. Well, they opted to be the real cowardly thing. They shipped these men overseas, turned them over to the French because the American general didn't want them. And the French had to finish training them. Now, the black troops that arrived, the first combat troops to arrive, were African American. The African American troops never gave up 1 inch of ground. None of them ever defected to the military, even when the Germans started issuing the propaganda, telling them everything bad that's happening back home, about the lynchings and bad treatment back home. Did everything they could to get them to defect, and they didn't. That's not in your books, and there won't be any questions on that. But the first Americans reached France in June of 1970, and as I said, there was an all-black unit. By March of 1918, 300,000 were there. But by war's end, there were 2 million American troops there. And during this time, no troop ships were sunk. Now, I've got closing battles. Your text spends very little time with battles, and I guess that's good, too, because I'm not a military historian, so I have trouble with battles. But some of the biggest battles were at the closing of the war. In March of 1819, of course, the Germans launched a massive assault on the Western Front. And the Allies were driven back to 50 miles from Paris. On July the 15th, the Germans threw all their reserves into drive for Paris because they managed to bring all their troops back from Germany. So now they've got some troops that have got experience, and they're going to throw them against the Allies. But after 3 days of battle, they were pushed back. So the German drive is stalled. The Allies counterattacked. Now, on September the 12th of 1918, 500,000 Americans and a few Canadians and a few French, darn few French, they drove the Germans from St. Michel. 2 weeks later, 896,000 American troops attacked in the Argonne Forest, and that's the biggest battle they're going to have. But as you can see, it's all along here. Germany and France are, they've got so much border in common. On October the 6th, 1918, Germany appealed to Wilson for armistice. Wait a minute, that's not, yeah. Okay, wait a minute, let me look at that again. Did I have the right date back here? March 1918, not 1819. I thought that didn't sound right when I said it. Okay, on October the 6th, 1918, Germany appealed to Wilson for an armistice. Now, Turkey and Bulgaria and Austria-Hungary were already out of the war. At 4 a.m. on November the 11th, the Germans signed the armistice. And you'll find this question in a lot of trivia games and even on Jeopardy sometimes. What is 11-11-11? The 11th month, the 11th day, the 11th hour. The armistice was signed ending World War I. The American Expeditionary Force had lost 48,909 men. They had 230,000 wounded. Disease and missing brings the total killed to 112,000. And that's less than 1% of the total of 10 million killed. So that tells you there is an awful lot of civilians that were killed in that war. Now, what was going on at home? There was a lot of agencies that were created. One of them was called the Committee on Public Information, the CPI. And they did this because there's a lot of anti-war things going on. It was created to combat this. And they started issuing propaganda like you would not believe. They started issuing patriotic films where these Germans would come into this little village somewhere in Europe and kill everybody, and they would always have them pictured as bloodthirsty Huns. They're very anti-Germanic films. And you're trying to stir up the anti-Germanic sentiment, which is bad because you got a lot of German people in this country. In all the high schools, the foreign language of German was no longer allowed to be spoken. You could no longer eat sauerkraut because that's a German dish, so we're calling it Liberty cabbage. You couldn't eat pretzels in a bar because that's German. Any orchestral work by Bach, etc., could not be played because he was German. And anybody who was a German American or an anti-war figure, they were badgered, beaten, and killed. It was rampant. And our beloved President Wilson did nothing to curb this vigilantism, and he even issued a statement, "Woe be to the man or group of men that seek to stand in our way." Now, to me, that's like waving a red flag. Then the government proceeded to pass the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act of 1917 and 1918, which is just a replay of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1799. In the Espionage Act, the postmaster had the right to go into your mail and remove any materials he considered treacherous or treasonous or that he didn't like. The Sedition Act With penalties on anyone using disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the flag, or our armed force uniforms. In other words, we were going to have liberty even if we had to bang the Statue of Liberty in the nose. And there was one guy who was watching a group of young recruits being trained, and I'm sorry, you get these young recruits, and sometimes they don't know left from right, and they were having trouble marching, getting their feet all mixed up, and he started laughing. He was arrested and thrown in jail for being abusive and scurrilous to our military men. Another case, a worker was going from door to door collecting funds for the Red Cross, and she comes, knocks on this one door, and this lady comes to the door. She's got her kid on her hip. She's pregnant, and she could hear another kid crying in the background. She's busy trying to cook supper, and lady wants some money for the Red Cross, and lady says, I don't have time to fool with you right now, and slammed the door in her face. She was arrested for being scurrilous and using abusive language. It was just getting to be ridiculous. If you were not totally 100% 50% red, white, and blue, you were troubled. I guess you'd say we went a little bit bonkers. The Socialist Party started being harassed. The Industrious Workers of the World Union was harassed. Eugene Debs was arrested without a lot of necessary evidence, convicted of violation of the Espionage Act because he spoke out against the government, and he was sent to jail. Hostility fostered toward anything, not 100% red, white, and blue, would lead you to go to jail, or what we call the Red Scare after the war. It got to the point where people would wrap themselves in the flag and do terrible things. Wilson actually sent American troops into Russia. Now, the excuse he used that he was trying to aid some not Hungarians, but some Czechoslovakians or some foreign group. He was trying to help them get out of Russia. No, he was sending them in there to help the anti-Bolsheviks because he was so much against Lenin and his group. He economically blocks Russia. He refuses to recognize Lenin's government. The troops are sent in, and they're in there for over 2 years before they can get out. Meanwhile, the Russians are just raising all kinds of hell because we've got American feet on their ground. That's an invasion. But Wilson didn't see it that way. We're aiding other people. So what about the cost of war? More than 5,000 new government agencies are created, and I'll get to a couple more in a few minutes. Now, the actual fiscal cost of the war was $32 billion. Now, this is money. This doesn't include lives. Our federal budget at that time was only $1 billion. So the government got together and, as common citizens, bought $23 billion in what they call Liberty bonds. The 16th Amendment was passed, and we got increased taxes from corporation and personal income. That raised another $10 billion. Now, if you add $23 billion and $10 billion, you get $33 billion. So we had $1 billion profit from the war. We came out ahead. And we didn't have any cities bombed. We didn't have any canals or bridges blown up. We had a full 100% workforce. Another one of the agencies was the War Industries Board. That was really the most powerful new agency created, and a man called Bernard Baruch was in charge. There was a Food Administration Agency under charge of Herbert Hoover, and he came up with the idea of meatless days or gasless days. And the way he would do this, everybody would take their turn. In theory, that day, if you didn't use any of that particular item, it would be that much more for the military. It was also during this time we came up with something called Liberty Gardens. You plant your own little garden and grow your own little tomatoes and stuff, and that way you wouldn't have to go to the store and buy them, so that government could buy more fruits and vegetables for the military. And in all honesty, to the day she died, my aunt planted a Liberty Garden every year, just a small garden, so she wouldn't have to go to the store and buy stuff. Fuel administration. Harry A. Garfield came up with the idea of how to save gas. He's the one you can credit with the daylight saving time, which we still use today, which, by the way, we went off of last week. I always remember him by thinking about Garfield the cat. And I can't see where it saves us any money because, well, for instance, now we've got more light in the morning and less in the afternoon, so I just have to turn my lights on earlier. To me, it doesn't make any sense. But the national government had taken unprecedented power, which it does in any war. And then all these new agencies that were being created saw themselves as friends to business. They're trying to help. They're trying to create economic stability. But many Americans doubted if the U.S. should have intervened in the war, especially the international workers of the world and the socialists. So that's why the CPI was created, to counteract the anti-war sentiment. And like I said, it flooded the nation with pro-war propaganda. And like I said, anything anti-German, it would send what they call 4-minute men out to inundate you in the language of the area that they were going into, whatever it was, to get you to be for the war. And they told production workers, if you work hard for democracy and fight, after the war, you're going to have an 8-hour day, which is what everybody wanted. But the government's intervening in American life like never before. You want to go on strike? Fine, we won't let you stop you from going on strike. But if you go on strike and it's a necessary business, we'll send the military in to take over. So what have you gained? You haven't lost any production time. So, of course, the government and the labor started working hand in glove. What's the purpose of a strike if you don't gain anything? And it also began to force companies to pay women and blacks equal wages. But we're still got a labor shortage because most of our men, millions of men are in the military. So African Americans and Mexican Americans are starting to fill the gap. We lowered the quotas, or raised the quotas, not lowered them, for the Mexicans to come in the Southwest. And we even sent recruiters to the South to bring young, strong men and women to the industrial cities of Cleveland and Chicago to work at the plants. And for a while it was fine because there wasn't any competition because the men were gone. Most of the women took over the domestic jobs, and the white women, American women, were then released to go work on airplanes and build all kinds of things that men had normally done before. That's where you start seeing Rosie the Riveter with her hair tied up in a bandana, a bib overall on, and she's out there welding. Happens at any war. When the men are gone, they bring the women in to work. But many women really were against the war. Some of the suffrage leaders supported, some didn't, but most of them that were for it, they sold bonds, they organized rallies, they worked in war production plants. They did everything they could to help. But meanwhile, we've got this push for suffrage. We still want to vote. We can work and build tanks and teach men how to fly airplanes, but we still can't vote. Something called the National Women's Party is a splinter group from the American Women's Suffrage movement, and they're pushing for suffrage. And they actually encouraged civil disobedience and demonstrations. They wore pants. They demonstrated at the White House. Woo, not good. And in 1920, they did get the 19th Amendment, the right for us women to vote, passed. The other women's groups had already gotten the 18th Amendment passed back in 1917, but it took 3 years to get it ratified. So it too went into effect. The 19th and the 18th both went into effect in 1920. We can't drink anymore public. You can't make, you can't manufacture, you can't distribute, you can't sell any alcoholic beverages, and we women can vote. But let's stop there just for a minute and digest the war. Now, this YouTube is about something called trench warfare, which your text did not go into, and I'm sorry I didn't even mention it that much either, but during the war in Europe, all across France, there were trenches dug, and the Allies would get in them to, to shoot, and then just a few hundred yards on the other side, the Germans had trenches. And it lasted for years. And this little film tells you what life was like in those trenches. I'd be curious to know just how many of you all were aware of the trench warfare. I thought that was a very moving, very impressive way to demonstrate. There wasn't a lot of noise. There wasn't any. I'm kind of funny. I like the old black and white movies. To me, sometimes they're much more memorable. But since we talked about so much, and we got up to the war and of course over, the last part of the chapter deals with the other things that were going on in our country during the war and right after. And it shouldn't be as long as this one. So thank you for